All right, so I saw this comment. I saw this comment on this thread. This I changed my mind about David Deutsch thread at Elliot's blog, and the person asked, anonymous asked, "The fuck is wrong with DD lately?" So I was curious, so I went to that, and I had to log out of Twitter because David Deutsch has blocked me, um, because he's into open discussion and error correction, not. And so he says, after I logged out, uh, by the way, it's blocking is so silly because you can just log out and see what people say. So David used block. It was not very effective. So David says an interesting connection. And then the thing he's quoting is this guy, Hermes of Reason, uh, who says critical memefulness, a discussion on how mindfulness meditation may help in discovering the presence of irrationalities, anti-rational memes. Okay. So I go to the video, I start watching, and I immediately have strong objections to the content. Forget about the like intro stuff. So I thought I would talk over those because I think it's actually an important issue, and it's an issue I've argued about with other people who've been into the sort of Popperian type community of ideas. So I'm going to start the video and start talking.
Uh-oh, looks like Hermes made an oopsie. What? The infallible Hermes of Reason made an oopsie. Yes, it's true. In my last video, I said some things that I was wrong to say.
Just this is a side comment. This is not the primary thing I'm going to talk about, but just this is like the most try hard social trying to be funny doing voices intro, and it's not even very good for what it's trying to do. It's like, I mean, I'm definitely not the right audience for this kind of thing in the first place, um, but I feel like I have some sense of what's good within the genre and what's not, and this just is kind of, I don't know, it's not good. It troubles me. But anyway, that's a total tangential aside and not my main point at all. I just didn't want to leave it without any comment.
Nah, just kidding. I actually just didn't explain it as clearly as I could have, so second time's the charm. So it's critical mindfulness again, baby, but this time explained and with memes. So in Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion, he emphasizes the problem of being lost in thought and how that kind of general distraction, or what he calls thinking without knowing that we're thinking, is a huge problem. And the reason why it's a problem is because, what he calls being lost in thought is basically a way in which we get distracted from living the lives that we actually want to live. So the case for mindfulness meditation here, which is a central part of his book, a central practice that he tries to teach, is that it will help us quickly notice when we are unthinkingly being led astray from living the lives that we want. And this is actually happening everywhere. I mean, people say
Notice, by the way, it's talking about lost in thought, but then
binge eat.
so he's talking about being lost in thought, but then talking about being unthinkingly led astray and from the life you want. Being lost in thought, I mean, it has a connotation to me that's not really what he seems to be talking about when you're just, I mean, the negative connotation, right? So if somebody's concentrating or pondering over something and they're sort of like another thing you say is somebody's like in their own head or something. And it says, for example, Gwen didn't hear a word you said. She was lost in thought. So she was thinking deeply, pondering, introspecting, not really paying attention to the world. Um, so now I guess this guy is just relating Sam Harris's view. So maybe Sam Harris is the one who's using the term in a non-standard way, but whatever. All right, let's continue.
Lives that we want. And this is actually happening everywhere. I mean, people say binge eat, even when they know that they don't really want to binge eat or they know they have like a problem with that, but they
Talking about binge eating is a really, like, that's a really different topic than being lost in thought. That's a bad habit.
still do it anyway. Now, what Sam Harris calls lost in thought or thinking without knowing that we're thinking isn't actually thinking. Thought is error correction.
All right, so let's back up because this is where it starts to go really off the rails. So let's just I'm gonna step back a couple of seconds because I want to talk about some other stuff he said.
Even when they know that they don't really want to binge eat or they know they have like a problem with that.
Right. So stopping it here, if you do something like binge eat or smoke or whatever, even if you like, you might, part of you might think that that's a bad idea, and you might have some real issues or concrete objections that you have to it. And like, smoking has causes health problems or costs money or whatever. Binge eating makes you fat and doesn't. Maybe it's like the stereotype is, uh, sometimes women will like binge eat ice cream if they're sad or something. And I'm not. It's just it's just a common stereotype. So if you do that, part of you might object to it, but part of you, like, you're doing it for a reason. It's serving some sort of purpose. And so you can't actually say that that it's like wrong because you don't fully know. There's an internal disagreement. You could think of it as like there's at least a couple of parts of you. One of the parts of you objects to the binge eating, and the other part of you, or the smoking or whatever it is, and the other part of you wants to do that and gets value out of that and doesn't see a problem with it. And so, and I'm just going to let this play a little bit for a second.
They will still do it anyway. Now, what Sam Harris calls lost in thought or thinking without knowing that we're thinking isn't actually thinking. Thought is error correction.
Right. So he's framing this discussion as like there's things you do and it's not really thinking. And I think that's a way of like the bad habits or whatever. And that's a very hostile framing to oneself because it's a way of attacking uh, parts of yourself by saying, "Oh, those are just the thoughtless parts. They're stupid. They want me to do dumb stuff. I'm going to ignore those." And so what people do is and that's a very common sort of strategy being sort of presented here as some new approach or discovery or something. But it's a very common strategy that people engage in, that sort of self-alienation where they condemn parts of themselves. They're super judgmental, and they just try and essentially impose change on their own personality, on their own habits, by an act of will. And that doesn't work. People, like, it might work for a little bit, but people tend to run out of willpower. It's like an ongoing cost of mental energy to do that. It's like an ongoing struggle. It's sort of like if like you've been in a bad relationship where you're constantly fighting with somebody and it just drains you. Well, this sort of strategy of looking at part of yourself as stupid, as having stupid desires that need to be overcome through just willpower, that's basically engaging in a constant struggle against yourself, and not a good struggle, but just a draining, exhausting fight. So that's really bad. By the way, he says um, that thinking is error correction. I think that's like error correction is certainly a big. This is more of a technical philosophy point, but error correction is certainly part of thinking. But like thinking, I would think also like if you think of um, thinking as involving like making a guess and then criticizing that guess, the making a guess part isn't actually necessarily an error correction step. The guess is what would be getting corrected. So the error correction is part of the process, but it's a distinct step, I think. So if anybody wants to, if I'm mistaken on that, I'd really like to know. But it struck me that that was a potential error. But again, technical philosophy point. Okay, so the big point here though is it's a bad idea to condemn and alienate parts of yourself as being unthinking. A better approach is, so there's this blog post by Elliot, and he talks about changing habits. People often think something they do is bad and then they try to stop right away. I'm going to make this bigger. Like smoking or spending lots of time on Facebook. Often they don't do anything at all about it for a long time. Then they abruptly try to quit their habit. People only call something a habit if they think it's bad. That's true. Um, first they judge. First they didn't judge their activity. They weren't thoughtful. Then they get super judgy. They think of a reason it's bad and now view it as totally unacceptable. If something is a significant part of your life, or you otherwise find it difficult to stop, then don't try to quit abruptly. Pay attention to what you do. Pay attention to how you feel about it. Try to understand why you do it. Try to learn more things about it, both good and bad. Write down factual notes about what you do, including thoughts and feelings you have as part of the activity. Think of it as an information gathering phase. Don't threaten the activity. So this is don't like, and this is me interjecting here, but like don't call it an unthinking part of, the product of an unthinking part of yourself. Like you have to go into it with an open mind. Maybe there's something good about the activity. Maybe it serves some role in your life you didn't realize or think about. So then continuing with what Elliot says, then that part of you will get defensive. Do introspection. Be more thoughtful, present, and mindful about it. So he talks about mindfulness, but this is a very different take. So that isn't an attack. Don't attack that part of yourself. And by the way, this is a book that basically applies this sort of approach to the topic of smoking. And it's basically an approach of self-persuasion. So I'm going to go back to, so Alan Carr's Easy Way to Stop Smoking. So everybody, like whatever habit you're trying to change, you could probably benefit from reading this. And I guess especially if you're a smoker, you should read that. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the video now. So let's see what else he has to say. Because I only watched up until about this point, and I was like, oh my god, I have to make a video commenting on this guy's video.
And so, in the case of binge eating, in spite of knowing that that's not really what you want, you have to not be thinking. It's not just your thinking is elsewhere. It is that you are actually not error correcting in that moment. Now, it's a common misconception.
Right. So he's framing it really strongly as like this part of you that wants to do this activity that this other part of you disagrees with is just like mindless. So he's approaching it in a very super judgy frame. So don't be confused by like, oh, this guy, he's saying be mindful, and then Elliot's saying be mindful, so don't they really agree? No, this is a very different tack that he's taking, at least so far.
To think that meditation is about becoming thoughtless, but I think rather what Sam Harris is really trying to say is that it is about becoming more thoughtful, where you are actually able to have like this kind of critical distance from you doing something unthinkingly, to where then you can sort of like remind yourself, oh yeah, I don't actually want to do this. I don't actually want to binge eat. I'm not actually, still hungry and that type of thing. So it opens the door to creative criticism there in that moment.
Right. So it can be good to take a minute to remind yourself about stuff, or like pause, um, take a break. Uh, if if you have a habit of eating automatically at certain times and you want to change that habit, you could work in a break of like thinking, okay, do I actually need this food? Am I actually hungry right now? That can be good.
So, in a very similar way that Sam Harris describes it, what mindfulness can get you to recognize is that you are not the, appearances in your mind per se, but you are more like the mind space in which those appearances are coming and going. And so,
This is very confusing and vague.
you're almost like the room of consciousness rather than what's in that room. Now, arguably, the defining quality of what makes a mind is its creativity. And creativity is dynamic. The whole notion of kind of going from one thing to another, and you might say being distracted, is actually like a necessary feature of our creativity, being able to, rearrange and combine existing things and try to solve different problems and stuff like that. I mean,
This is a big tangent. I'm confused.
we have like a whole range of stuff that we could potentially be interested in, or a whole range of interesting problems that we could be interested in solving. And so it's necessary that we're able to kind of like go from one thing to another in that way. So distraction is only a problem insofar as it relates to not actually thinking. But the ability to kind of have a wide range of things that you're interested in and kind of just hop from one thing to another and explore all of them in a way is a good thing. I mean,
So is the point that like getting distracted can be good, except when you're distracted by your like bad unthinking habits or something? Is that's that's I don't know.
if you're solving problems and you're having fun and stuff like that, there's nothing to worry about. Although, given that our minds work in this way, the space of, potentially moving from one thing to another is the space in which unthinkingness, or you might even call it irrationality, rears its head or takes advantage of and exploits. And there are real things out there that are looking to take advantage of that dynamic capacity of our minds. And those things are what David Deutsch, in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, and in particular his chapter, The Evolution of Culture, calls anti-rational memes.
So I might be misremembering, but I don't recall David like framing, because basically this guy Hermes seems to be saying that like we can do all sorts of stuff and switch topics and change our minds about what to focus on, and that's good. But then in doing that and being able to, let me
So a
see.
meme
Let me go back a bit.
is the space in which there's nothing to worry about. Although, given that our minds work in this way, the space of, potentially moving from one thing to another is the space in which unthinkingness, or you might even call it irrationality, rears its head or takes advantage of and exploits. And there are real things out there that are looking to take advantage of that dynamic capacity of our minds. And those things are what David Deutsch, in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, and in particular his chapter, The Evolution of Culture, calls anti-rational memes. So a meme is like a behavior with this corresponding meaning or idea that gets itself replicated in the same way that genes get themselves replicated, namely by just simply outcompeting their rivals.
So there's a couple of issues that I have with what he's saying so far. Um, and also just a more of a meta comment at first is that if he wants to talk about the beginning of infinity, or even whatever the Harris book or whatever he mentioned earlier, he should have the text on the screen, um, and talk about it and like use quotes and talk about it in a serious way. It's instead of like he's making himself very primary in the video and his like apartment or whatever this is, as opposed to making the books primary. The books essentially are just props, and I think that's a problematic thing. But also, so he's right that memes involve, uh, like he's talking about memes and replication. But if you're talking about like a problematic habit that someone has, like he brought up binge eating, and so the first thing is that like you could have a habit that is just conceivably you could have some bad habits. It's just like some weird thing you made up on your own, where it wouldn't even be a meme. But I would guess that probably most bad habits aren't like people's original own creative things. It's something that they copied from somewhere else. So okay. So one thing I think Hermes's discussion leaves out so far is a meme uh, that you regard. And by the way, I'm calling them bad habits, even though like I'm assuming for the sake of argument that they're bad habits. Even though I do really think that if you want to change stuff, you do have to look at stuff in a more like non-judgmental way. But just for the sake of argument, okay, let's say you have some bad habits or whatever. Um, the way that Hermes presents it, it's almost like the memes are kind of like lying in wait for you to be distracted or something, and then they get their they get their shot in, and maybe take control for a while. And I think that that could be a reasonable description for some stuff, maybe. But a lot of stuff that people regard as like a bad habit that they have is really just part of a larger meme, I think. So, like, for example, um, there's the binge eating thing that he brought up, and I brought up the example earlier of like if somebody is sad because of a breakup and then they binge eat ice cream, and the stereotype is it's the girl that does this, so maybe they binge eat like Ben and Jerry's with their girlfriends to get over it. And that's in that sort of situation, it's not really it's not really like the memes are lying in wait. It's kind of part of the script. It's part of what you do to get over a breakup is, you know, do engage in that activity of the eating of the ice cream. And you might see problems with that. Like you might not like the fact that you gain weight when you eat a bunch of ice cream or something like that. But you're engaging in the activity for a reason, which is presumably something like when you have some emotional pain because of something like a breakup, then hanging out with your friends and eating something tasty like ice cream distracts you and makes you feel better for a while. Now, phrased that way, like you're doing something because you're sad and then you want to do some stuff that makes you feel happy. That actually sounds like pretty reasonable behavior. Um, so even if we presume that there's some irrationality, some irrational meme involved at some level in this scenario of the breakup and then the binge eating of the Ben and Jerry's, you can't necessarily presume you know exactly where it is. It could be that, like, given some set of premises, which you could doubt and you could say, well, there's some mistake in the premises, but given some set of premises, the behavior is actually pretty reasonable. And there might be various changes that you could make, um, in order to deal with the problems that you see with the binge eating of the ice cream. Like maybe you could switch to that like low calorie halo top ice cream, or maybe you could change your post breakup activities with your friends to like some physical activity, like going for a run or something like that. Like there's various, or maybe you could reconsider your theories on romance. Like there's all sorts of levels of, uh, there's all sorts of changes you could make at different levels to address the issues that you see. But I think what I'm getting at is that like one of the dangers that I think people can run into when they're talking about anti-rational memes is that they get very arrogant about, like they hear this idea, which is very powerful. They read about it in BOI or whatever, and they kind of get the gist, and then they become very arrogant about their ability to successfully identify anti-rational memes, and so it becomes another sort of tool in what I think I referred to earlier as like self-alienation, where they try and suppress and cut off and deny parts of themselves because they've decided that, oh, this part or that part is part of an anti-rational meme, as opposed to investigating themselves and their reactions and what they like non-judgmentally. um, they use the framing of anti-rational memes in order to be hyper judgmental and to say, oh, well, BOI says this is dumb. So, and that I think is really harmful. And it can be really self-destructive. If you can make small improvements to your situation where you figure out something, like I was saying earlier, where, oh, if you want to do the binge eating ice cream to get over the breakup with the boyfriend ritual, you figure out like some low calorie ice cream you like, or change to a different, or maybe you can change to a different activity but still do social stuff with your friends or whatever. Those are ways to improve your life, and those are valuable, but you'll only be looking for those ways to improve your life um, if you treat your, like, the things that you want, the parts of yourself that want that, as legitimate, as parts, like you have to have a tolerant, self accepting attitude in order to even identify opportunities to make these small changes. If you don't have such an attitude, then what you do is you try and do more revolutionary changes without having the background of engaging in the sustained effort at self-persuasion that making big changes involves. Because it could be like, well, you try and make one change and maybe it helps a little, but then you run into another problem, and then you make another change and it helps a little, but then you run into another problem, and then you realize, okay, at this point you tried smaller stuff, it hasn't quite done the job, so then you make a bigger change. But to just start with the bigger change at the outset because you've decided that part of yourself is like bad or irrational or unthinking or driven by anti-rational memes or whatever it is, that's not a good attitude. It's sort of like, there's then this is a total analogy, and it's a loose analogy, so I don't want to say it's like, a one-to-one perfect match or anything, but it's like, um, under capitalism, if you want to improve the situation in the world, there's all sorts of stuff you could do. You could start a business, you could invent a product, um, you can write a book and try and get people to buy it. You can, there's a million things you can do. But in order to see those opportunities, you have to, at some level, like you have to think that the society you're living in is like good and decent in some way and worth improving, if you don't accept that, then like if you think it's a fundamentally illegitimate sort of society, then you get this sort of situation we have with the left right now, where they want to make, like they think the society is bad. They're not looking out for opportunities to make incremental improvements. Instead, they kind of want to tear the whole thing down and start anew on a different set of premises. And so when people do that, it can often be, it's often been historically very, very destructive. And so it goes for societies, and so it can go for individuals. And let me say that there's something good about looking for problems and wanting to improve them. Like if you're just like, oh, everything's perfect, I don't want anything to change, whether about society or about yourself, that's clearly bad. Because there's always things that could be improved, but you also, like, you want to make sure both that you have the right standard for what would be an improvement and also that you have the right method. And I guess my comments here with regard to personal improvement and the themes discussed in this video have been more about method. It's like, you don't want to be pressuring yourself to make big changes that you haven't adequately explained to yourself the basis for. It's sort of like if you're struggling with something, if something isn't easy to change, then your attitude to yourself should be sort of like your attitude to a friend. And when I say that, I assume, I'm saying it from the perspective of you as a friend who's not like a pushy asshole, but is just more trying to be like friendly and persuasive, and bring up a point or two when they're open to it, but not be pressuring, not be pushy, not be controlling. So okay, let's continue with this video a little bit.
And the anti-rational memes do this by suppressing creative criticism, while there are rational memes which rather encourage creative criticism. So especially the anti-rational memes that suppress creative criticism, they have to take advantage of this space or potential for doing things unthinkingly, because if you were thinking, that means you'd be error correcting, that means you would be using creative criticism. And as we know, this potential for doing things unthinkingly comes out of this space where we're able to be sort of distracted and dynamic, going from one thing to another. And so what the anti-rational memes do is they hijack that space and entrench certain patterns of behavior that we can do unthinkingly. And again, they have to do that, otherwise we would be able to recognize them quickly and error correct our way out of doing them.
So my biggest comment here is that there's something about, so the description is, let's see, a discussion of how mindfulness meditation may help in discovering the presence of anti-rational memes. Now that's a pretty big topic, where basically 5 minutes out of 6 minutes, we're 5 minutes in out of 6 minutes total in the video, and he's just basically gotten his description of memes out, like even what they are, which I found not to be the clearest presentation. But I mean, part of it is like there's a lot of meme content in BOI. There's a lot of discussion about the topic, and he's trying to compress that in not very much time, and then relate it to the topic of mindfulness meditation. So, and so the whole video, given the scale of the topics that he wants to give a treatment to, the whole video is just it's just trying to accomplish too much. And if he wants to give people like practical advice about dealing with things like binge eating or something, you don't need, this is going to be my original comment, you don't need the conceptual framework of memes to make a short video that's useful about that topic. Like, you could talk about this book or this essay. You don't need to try and bring in uh, the whole discussion of anti-rational memes. It's unnecessary. If you want to discuss anti-rational memes, or memes in general, that's also a fine topic, but you shouldn't be trying to shoehorn in that discussion into another discussion, or at the very least, you should have like, your hour-long meme video, and then you link that, and then, people can, that can be like the prerequisite video, and then people can watch your stuff that builds off of that. That would be a reasonable structure. But I don't think this is a very reasonable structure, and I don't think it's a very good or clear treatment. And like, he's not going to say a lot in a minute that's going to help anybody much, Like, that's just not enough time. Like, you're not going to give people very useful discussion about meditation advice to the extent that could be useful. You're not going to convey that in such a short amount of time because you had, so much introductory discussion. There's like the social intro, and then the stuff about Harris, and then the stuff about being distracted and the human capabilities, and then the meme stuff. And now he's going to get to meditation. So let's continue.
So it's been a while since I've read Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, where, this is where I first learned about mindfulness meditation. But I highly doubt that he talks about memes in the book. But I do think that there is a sense in which, you could just say irrationalities. I think that there's a sense in which...
Like, why didn't he check before he made this video what the content... Like, he couldn't even, like... I mean, I don't know when the Harris book came out, but even if it was conceivable that it came out, where when like memes had been part of the discussion and Harris could know about them, like you could just like check the index, man. Like, honestly. And why do you have paper copies of books? Like, what is that? Just get text. Get Kindle at least, like, anyway.
Being able to be more thoughtful and mindful about your space of thinking or capacity to think in a moment in which you might not be thinking can be extremely valuable to overcome your irrationalities. Of course, that is just kind of one step in the right direction. You need other kind of creative and conceptual type criticisms in order to actually not just fall right back into that pattern of behavior. So I will link to Sam Harris.
So, like, seriously, talking about even one simple example of method, because like maybe Hermes has something useful to say about this topic. Seriously, like that, like he could have some good useful tips that people might find helpful. But the discussion has been at such an incredibly high level of abstraction from anything real that we'll never know.
Book in the description below, but I also highly recommend, and will link to David Deutsch's book, The Beginning of Infinity, for more on memes, how knowledge works, a little bit about irrationality. The Beginning of Infinity is my favorite book of all time, so highly recommend that you get that, and you can, get both for kind of maybe some kind of convergence on the two in regard to maybe how to unshackle from our irrationalities. And that is all for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Keep making progress.
I will be hitting neither. What I will do, however, is I will link both this Changing Habits essay, which I only read some of, so you should read the rest, and this Amazon link for easy way to stop smoking, because those can actually be helpful. But so overall, like, I didn't really get the point of the video. I didn't really find that it clarified anything. And my whole point is in looking at it was, so David said this is an interesting connection. So somebody's going to see this and watch this video and maybe think that they understood something about the beginning of infinity when they really haven't. So I don't think David should be endorsing videos of this quality. So that's it.